Hello, and welcome to this Evaluate webinar on the 2024 Preview Report. I'm Melody Marden, your host for today's session. Our conversation today is based on this report. The preview includes Evaluate Pharma forecast data for this year, including the top-selling drugs, biggest potential launches, and much more. We'll talk through some of the highlights of the report in today's session, but if you want to dive into the data further, please do read the report, which you'll find on the Evaluate website. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping points to cover. The webinar should last for about 40 minutes, and it is being recorded, so we will share a link to that recording along with the slides following today's discussion. Please do ask questions as we go through the session. We'll try to answer as many of them as possible. For any questions that we are not able to get to, we will respond following today's webinar. You can ask questions through the platform via the Ask a Question section towards the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to direct your question to one of the speakers specifically, please indicate that. Now, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have Tsang, Principal, Consulting and Analytics, who will report on highlights in today's market, followed by Chancellor, Thought Leadership Director, who will discuss trends in the marketplace and contextualize highlights and impact on today's key stakeholders. Before I hand this off to Taz, however, I'd like to share some key points from the 2024 preview. As many of us know, biopharma sentiment in 2023 was low. However, 2024 holds promise, especially since global interest rates, considered an Achilles heel with this sector, seems to have topped out. With that being said, the macro environment still is a bit precarious and vulnerable. While recovery is anticipated, it will not be without challenge and possible speed bumps. Today, we are going to explore what we see as hints of an upturn that many believe is now underway. We also will discuss signs of ongoing challenges for some in biopharma, especially those that need to raise cash outside of what we'll call A-list therapeutic areas and mechanisms of action, or new unproven approaches. As we all have seen, there were a number of hot areas last year, including obesity and ADCs in their role in oncology, both garnering financial support in spite of other areas experiencing more dire funding. Many see this skew continuing in the new year. Follow-on projects from Lilly and Novo, as well as others, rank among the sector's most valuable pipeline assets, so emerging metabolic data will continue to be a big story in 2024. However, this field certainly is not immune to setbacks, as we saw with Pfizer's stumble in phase 3 of their oral agent, danuglipron. As we look ahead, two themes for the new year involve manufacturers and whether or not they can keep up with demand, and the ability to convince payers that the benefits of these novel medicines justify the higher cost. Today, we will also highlight other big hopes waiting in the wings. In 2024, could we finally see a late-stage breakthrough in pain? Also, small developers are involved heavily in the list of the biggest potential drug launches, which, by the way, is signaling concern about biotech investors favoring deal bankers. As we look into IPOs and venture capital, we see how the financing wheels seemed to turn a bit faster in 2023, raising hopes for further acceleration in 2024. And lastly, the FDA is on track for another strong year for approvals. It is important to keep in mind, though, that these positive signals must be tempered in reality. While financial markets remain a bit jittery, biopharma will be held to a higher standard to demonstrate value. Said another way, only clear successes will be rewarded. I'd now like to turn this over to my colleague, Tez, to discuss some of the key highlights in today's market. Tez?
Thank you, Melody. Thank you for your introduction. I shall start by providing some context to the 2024 preview report, in that it was created in early December 2023, with data extracted from the Evaluate platform in November 2023. The sales forecast underlying the analysis has been generated through consensus forecasts collated through sell-side analysts. So let's begin with the biggest performers of 2024. Keytruda is predicted to be the biggest selling drug this year, generating $27.2 billion US. Since overtaking Humira as the biggest selling drug outside of the COVID vaccines, Keytruda is expected to remain number one ranked drug at least until 2028, which is Evaluate's current projection horizon for consensus forecasts. Keytruda's performance has been remarkable considering the availability of other successful PD-L1s in the market, and this includes Bristol Myers Squibb's Opdivo, which is currently ranked 7th with predicted sales of over $11 billion. With the current impact that the GLP-1s have been showing in the media, as well as the industry across both diabetes and obesity markets, we see Novo's Ozempic coming in at number 2. I should also mention here that Evaluate collates forecasts by brand, so that the sales presented here are for Ozempic only and do not include Wegovy. So if we are presenting sales by molecule, then semaglutide would feature as this year's highest selling drug. Coming in at third is Dupixent, which shows strong sales growth, followed by Eliquis, and then Gilead's HIV drug, Biktarvy. Since the report was created, Boehringer Ingelheim's SGL2 inhibitor, Jardiance, has jumped into the top 10 performers of 2024, with expected sales in excess of $10 billion. In contrast, Pfizer's COVID vaccine sales have been downgraded this year to just below $8 billion. Drugs of note outside the top 10 include AbbVie's Humira, which is still expecting to generate over $9 billion despite becoming off patent, and Vertex's cystic fibrosis drug, Trikafta.
Yeah, Tez, if I can, a couple of observations, and you mention even since when the data were pulled in November, you've had movement within this top 10, so Jardiance coming in, another drug falling out. Been looking at these, the highest selling drugs over many, many years. And what strikes me is that it's actually the dynamism within this list that is most interesting. Perhaps going back, a few years, it always used to be the same drugs appearing year after year, with just incredibly persistent revenues. But I think actually what we are seeing now is an era, perhaps we're entering an era when drugs can launch incredibly quickly. We've seen the COVID vaccine revenues. We're now seeing the revenues of GLP-1s and obesity adding to their use in diabetes. At the other end of the scale, we're also seeing drugs fall away, perhaps quicker than they would otherwise done. I'm not going to say it's encouraging, but it's interesting to see the absence of Humira in this list, and perhaps a sign that the biosimilar market now is becoming certainly a bit more effective in gaining market share and therefore in curbing those long-term revenues of those huge blockbuster biologic products.
Yeah, I certainly agree, Dan. I think dynamic is certainly a theme in this webinar right now, where I'm trying to replicate the results of this report. But things are forever changing on a monthly basis. Okay, so let's move over to the next slide. 2024's biggest new sales generators. So unsurprisingly, there are 3 GLP-1 drugs that feature in the top 5 new sales generators of 2024, namely the semaglutide brands Wegovy and Ozempic, as well as Lilly's tirzepatide, which is sold as Mounjaro for diabetes. Since tirzepatide's launch in obesity late last year under the brand name Zepbound, sell-side analysts have upgraded its forecast outlook to predict over $2 billion in new sales in 2024. But what is impressive for these GLP-1s is how the sales of these drugs have really hit the ground running, achieving high revenues so soon after launch and relatively early in their life cycle. We previously mentioned Keytruda's position as 2024's biggest selling drug, so it's still rather impressive to see it on this list as one of the fastest growing drugs this year. The drug has seen continued success through further approvals as part of combination therapies, and advances into earlier treatment lines for various cancers. We also see Skyrizi, Dupixent, Darzalex that all feature in 2024's top-selling drugs, and their presence on this list just demonstrates their upward trajectory in sales growth. Daiichi Sankyo and AstraZeneca's Enhertu comes in as the 9th place drug for new sales. Enhertu is expected to generate over $4 billion in 2024, but this will also rise to over $10 billion in 2028.
Yeah, a couple of commonalities really jump out. I suppose if you're trying to think of what the ingredients are to get rapid sales increases, the big one, I think, a really common theme is follow-on drugs. So whether it's a drug in a new indication, such as a GLP-1 moving from diabetes to rebranding itself in obesity, but also follow-ons within a franchise. So we have Skyrizi, Rinvoq, both featuring very prominently with fast growth as they were able to capture some of the market share that was previously held by Humira. We also have Roche's Vabysmo for wet AMD, which is able to benefit from an existing established position in this market. The other thing which jumps out, I'm really enthused and intrigued by this, is the modalities story. So a lot of biologics, a lot of complex drugs, but the first time we have a bispecific antibody in Vabysmo, we have an antibody drug conjugate in Enhertu. I think, these are good examples of really sophisticated new drugs that are able to not just build upon the clinical science, but also then have a commercial impact on the market. I think perhaps the first of many to come.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, let's move over to the top performing companies in 2024. So this year is expected to see Roche as a top performing company by prescription sales, followed by Johnson & Johnson. Following on the theme of dynamic changes, since the report was created, there have been changes in the positions of these companies. But what we should mention here is that the top 6 pharmas are expected to recognize between $49 billion and $54 billion, meaning that around $5 billion separates those top 6 companies for prescription drugs. This year sees GSK drop out the top 10 at the expense of Novo Nordisk. However, the UK pharma actually shows sales growth of around 4% CAGR up until 2028, which is comparable to the companies in the top 6 of this chart. Pfizer's acquisition of Seagen has not resulted in any major changes in the ranking of companies this year, with Seagen's portfolio likely to be showing more mid to long term or longer term impact on Pfizer's revenues. Quickly chasing up behind GSK is Eli Lilly in 12th position, whose sales growth is expected to see them climb the ranks in these forthcoming years. We expect to see Eli Lilly penetrate the top 5, potentially the top 3 in the next 3 to 4 years.
Yes, I have a question here. You addressed Pfizer's acquisition of Seagen towards the end of last year. We can also look at Amgen, acquiring Horizon for about $27.8 billion in October of last year. Do you see some of the movement here with acquisitions and some of the top players having a significant impact on their standing?
I think the interim, in the near term, the impact appears to be relatively minor. We do see increments in total revenues, but in terms of the positioning of these companies, particularly the top 10, which seems to be fairly static, so to speak, that there may be 1 or 2 entrants on 1 or 2 levers each year, but overall, the near term is that there are no major changes in the performance of these companies.
Yeah, many of these acquisitions that we're seeing aren't acquisitions of revenues, but they're acquisitions of revenue potential. So certainly 2024, perhaps too early to see the effect of Amgen's acquisition. Even if when you model in the portfolio that Amgen is acquiring, it's approaching the top 10, and maybe one day we'll cross that kind of cusp. But similarly, some of the other deals that have been announced, the spate of deal making towards the end of last year, in the beginning of this year, Bristol Myers Squibb very active, Amgen very active. Not these aren't a 2024 revenue story, but they're more of a long term. That when we extrapolate these sales out, they're shoring up their position as we kind of scarily exit this decade. It's kind of crazy to think where we are already, but yeah, that's the rationale behind these recent deals.
Okay, if we can move over to our next slide, which is companies ranked by global new sales in 2024. Again, there are no surprises to see that Novo and Lilly lead the way in new sales in 2024. As we've already pointed out, the semaglutide and tirzepatide brands within diabetes and obesity, the principal drivers of that growth. AstraZeneca comes in at third position for new sales, largely driven by its own anti-diabetic therapy, Farxiga, its PD-L1 Imfinzi, as well as its Soliris follow-on therapy, Ultomiris. These three drugs will account for just under $2.5 billion in new sales in 2024. Amgen has seen two recent launches in 2023 that will both contribute to rapid sales growth this year. Tepezza is Amgen's ophthalmic drug in Graves' disease and saw $500 million in sales booked last year, and it's expected to generate over $2 billion in 2024. Krystexxa is Amgen's anti-gout medication, which is also expected to achieve blockbuster status in its first year. As we have seen from the highest generators of new sales in 2024, Roche's VEGF antibody for wet AMD, Vabysmo, is expected to make $4 billion this year. And also Tecentriq is also expected to perform quite strongly, presumably aided by the launch of its subcut version for its PD-L1 therapy. At the forefront of GSK's push this year will be two of its vaccines. Shingrix sales is expected to grow from 4.2 billion last year to over 5 billion this year. GSK also stole the march in the RSV market. Arexvy, launched already last year, achieved blockbuster status in its first year. Coming in at 10th, highest new sales generator is Daiichi Sankyo, which is largely attributable to its ADC drug Enhertu. Daiichi is expecting to receive $3.5 billion in sales for 2024, with a projected outlook of over 8.5 in 2028.
So one of the first things I wanted to do when I saw this slide is compare it to the slide previous, and this is an exercise that you can do as well if you've got the PDF or the ebook version of this report. So what are the companies that are big top 10 in 2024 but are not part of that top 10 growth cohort in new sales? So which companies, I suppose, are falling backwards relative to their peers? And I think it's quite telling the kind of companies we're talking about. On this chart, no Bristol Myers Squibb, no AbbVie. These are two companies that I just mentioned have been very heavily involved in acquiring. In I suppose their biggest need is that near-term growth. So lots and lots of their cash has been deployed in new acquisitions. Novartis isn't here. Novartis has been heavily rumored to be involved with cytokinetics. Whether that song and dance is still going to be continued, we'll have to wait and see. And no Johnson & Johnson either. So I think the kind of companies that might be more involved on the deal-making side are those that are perhaps lacking the internal growth drivers and will be looking to opportunities externally in order to boost revenues.
Great, thanks. That leads us nicely over onto our next slide, the biggest potential drug launches of 2024. Before we discuss the launches and the ones to watch for this year, we should add that there are no guarantees that these assets will actually reach the market this year. Drugs have been ranked based on forecasted revenues in 2028, and top of the tree is Karuna Therapeutics CAR-XT therapy. As you've recently seen or heard, Karuna Therapeutics has featured heavily in the news following its acquisition by BMS for $14 billion that was announced last month. CAR-XT is a novel mechanism targeting multiple subtypes of the muscarinic receptors for the potential oral treatment of neuropsychiatric disorders, primarily schizophrenia, but also dementia-related psychosis. The results were published in The Lancet last month, showing CAR-XT's efficacy towards positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia without showing the adverse events typically seen in the current use antipsychotics, such as somnolence and weight gain. So a PDUFA date has been set for September of this year after the NDA was accepted by the FDA in November 2023. It now looks as if persistent attempts to target beta amyloid to halt the onset and progression of Alzheimer's disease is now coming to fruition. Following the launch of Leqembi last year, Eli Lilly hopes to launch his own beta amyloid antibody, donanemab, for Alzheimer's disease. There may be renewed hope for treatments that delay onset for neurodegenerative disease, particularly given that the recent news where blood biomarkers may be able to predict Alzheimer's disease potentially 10 to 15 years before age of onset. In a similar vein to unsuccessful attempts to develop novel therapies for Alzheimer's, NASH has also been somewhat of a graveyard for R&D assets that have failed to show efficacy. However, NASH may see its first approval in March of this year through Madrigal's resmetirom, which is shown to reduce fat content in livers as well as reduce fibrosis. And finally, on the theme of modalities and ADCs, Daiichi and AstraZeneca's second therapy, datopotamab, is expected to launch this year in lung and breast cancers.
Yeah, looking at this list, some really interesting themes. The first three diseases, as you say, Tez, all rightfully areas in which R&D has been challenged. Perhaps the reason why these three are at the top of the list is, the unmet need and the lack of approved therapy, the lack of recent therapeutic advances. So clearly there is huge pent-up demand, and also just noting that these are pretty large prevalent diseases as well. So potentially bucking that trend towards more precise therapies in subcategories of cancer, of immunology, and rare diseases. So perhaps a slight shifting of R&D priorities. The other observation, and I want to save this for the next slide, but just tease it now, is some of the revenue totals we're seeing here. So nothing. Yes, we have blockbusters, but they're not kind of mega blockbusters, certainly by the scale of some of the drugs that we've been speaking about previously. So yes, these are some really important therapeutic advances here. These drugs are very much in demand by potential acquirers, but potentially the scale isn't quite large on a historical perspective when we're looking at maybe none of these drugs will be penetrating that top 10 list, for example.
Great. Okay, I think that brings us nicely to our next slide. Actually, it's in terms of identifying US approvals for 2024. So we are hoping for another strong year in 2024 with around an estimated 65 new approvals in the US. And in keeping with the theme that Dan just mentioned here, if we take into account the revenues generated from the approvals of this year, and this is based on the fifth year forecasted sales, then arguably we are expecting less revenues generated per approval. And this is likely to be attributable to orphan drug approvals and new products developed for targeted patient populations.
Yeah, I love this analysis. It's really nice to be able to take what we predict to happen in 2024, project forward 5 years, and then compare to cohorts going backwards. So certainly if you're thinking about R&D productivity, numbers of new innovations, the pipeline is encouraging, expecting to have another strong year for FDA approvals based on kind of current likelihoods of approval, current clinical data sets, current pipelines. But perhaps the combined commercial impact of these medicines isn't necessarily as large as it has been. Is pharma perhaps moving towards strategies where it's developing more molecules, perhaps with lower commercial potential, but through the kind of sheer weight of drugs that it is launching, then it is able to sustain the revenue growth that we are seeing. Now, if we extrapolate way back out to the top line, pharma R&D, pharma prescription revenues from today through to 2028, the industry is still growing. It's still growing at a healthy clip. 6 to 7% CAGR, but perhaps just we're seeing that increased market fragmentation. In order to get to that 6 to 7% year-on-year growth, more and more drug launches are going to be needed.
And Dan, a question for you. Do you feel that, with I'll say the smaller available populations sometimes associated with precision medicine, and while there is a movement towards, increased acuity and precision in identifying subpopulations, do you think for some of the smaller players it may take them out because there isn't enough reward at the end of the year for bringing it to market, and that mainly becomes more of a game for the larger players who could sustain the R&D levels required to bring it to market and also sustain potentially the lower revenues per each approved product?
Well, the one thing that you have with smaller patient populations is the ability to target, to launch a drug and support it with promotional spend, reach your patients without, having to compete with tremendously large sales forces. So I think the environment of an increasingly fragmented market suits smaller players. But there is an economics argument. Drug development is getting more and more expensive. We kind of know the common figures. That 2 to 3 billion per approved drug. In a time when capital has been a bit more constrained, it's a harder sell for smaller drug developers to be able to get all the way through from proof of concept and then launching drugs. Certainly, the amount of money that they need to raise just to run the clinical trials is tremendous. And then when you're thinking about commercializing a therapy, it's a pretty small cohort of biotechs that then self-commercialize. But I think it's a case by case. I think you have to look at each drug on its own merits. There will be cases where biotechs will make that transition, commercialize drugs successfully. But certainly there are cases where that drug is best served to be within the portfolio of a larger company. It's not just as well the data set that a biotech can produce to get regulatory approval. But I like to say drugs are a product of their nurture, not their nature. And in order for these drugs to really reach their patient potential, it may require sustained investment well beyond that initial first approval. And is a biotech able to continue to turn to its investors, raise money for further trials, further new indications, further geographies? Probably not. So I think those really long-term potential assets will be the typical ones that you see in the large pharma portfolios.
So Dan, we've been getting some questions from the audience. I didn't know before we, started addressing those. Did you have anything you wanted to talk about as far as trends in the marketplace and the impact on key stakeholders?
Oh, well, I mean, it's a pretty big question. Where do you start? Well, let's break it down a little bit. I've hinted a little bit about deals, acquisitions. I love in your introduction that you talked a little bit about inflation and the cost of capital. These are so intimately linked, and it's only been recently that it's been so clear how inflation rates affect the ability of biotechs to raise capital, affect the ability of these drugs to progress through the clinic. And in times when inflation's high or capital availability is low, then it really increases the importance of pharma and deal making. Pharma is an essential partner to biotech in times when capital is low. Those upfront fees, those partnerships, even those acquisitions, these are essential to get drugs keep moving. So we're still in a period where inflation is higher than it has been. So I think we're still going to be in a time when pharma is generally more active when it comes to engaging in deal making. Also haven't mentioned it yet, but we also have this thing called a patent cliff coming. 26 to 28, tremendous amounts of industry revenues are at risk. Not necessarily all going to be lost, because a lot of the drugs that are losing patent protection are more complex to copy, so they'll still be able to retain some market share. But nevertheless, it's another kind of pressure all adding into that equation, which means that I think pharma is going to be engaging very actively on that deal-making side, acquisitions, licensing, partnerships.
Thank you. Very engaging, broad discussion thus far among the three of us. but I would like to bring the audience in at this point. Let's take a look at some of the questions and comments that have been coming in so far. Please continue to submit them. Also, we certainly would like to continue these discussions offline, so please continue to submit any questions or comments. And again, if we're not able to get to all of them during today's session, we will be following up following today's discussion. Dan, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and I've seen some questions and comments coming in from the audience as well, is the IRA. We would be remiss not to at least touch upon that, right? And so we've heard that the list of the first targeted 10 removes some uncertainty, but however, there's not 100% assurance that we have the final 10. We've also heard that there might be some consideration for biosimilars and generics, not to mention the underpinning of litigation in the mix. Clearly, a lot of moving pieces. Can you weigh in here, Dan, and provide some insights and thoughts on this?
Well, you summarized that quite nicely. I don't know whether the 10 is going to change. I suspect it is what's announced is what's going to be negotiated. The next, I suppose, date in the diary for those that are watching this is the maximum fair price that these manufacturers are going to receive for their products. So once we know the level of discounting that's going to be required in order to sell into Medicare, then that also removes further uncertainty. We can begin to model what the dollar impact is to these products and their revenues. Certainly in Medicare, still the unknown about how the IRA is going to affect their ability to sell at the price that they want to and have previously into commercial channels. Any removal of uncertainty, I think, is great. It allows investors, it allows decision makers to move forwards with a bit more confidence while you're still in the period, while you were digesting what the news are. It's hard to deploy capital to make investment decisions with any degree of certainty. So yeah, look, I think there's we're in this kind of limbo period, I think, where we are waiting for these prices to come through, because that is ultimately the goal of this legislation is to lower drug costs. We want to know, well, how much of these drug costs are going to be lowered by. Until we're at that stage, then sit and wait. We can definitely say some things are happening already, though. One thing's clear in speaking to our clients about the Inflation Reduction Act is how much it's already factoring into thought processes and workflows. Certainly in terms of how to develop a drug, which clinical trials to run, where to run those clinical trials, which deals to get done as well. So if I rewind, I love talking about deals, but if we think about some of the acquisitions that have been made so far, a lot of deals that have been closed are for companies that are not particularly exposed to the IRA. Melody, you've mentioned Horizon. There's Seagen and Immunogen, those ADC platform companies, not particularly exposed at all. Schizophrenia assets have been in demand. This is a disease that's not particularly prevalent in the Medicare population. We see more deals for antibodies in immunology. Whether these deals are probably all very in vogue for pharma as it is already, but certainly the advent of the IRA perhaps just tips that balance even further, because they can transact on these deals with more certainty. But perhaps the companies that they're looking at with R&D programs against diseases that affect the elderly, or with small molecule platforms, while there is that uncertainty, perhaps those deals are just being held a little bit longer.
It's interesting, Dan. That was going to be one of the other points I was going to come back to you with, and you hit upon it nicely, is the impact on FTC and deal making and the potential increased attractiveness for assets that potentially will be less impacted by IRA, especially in the shorter term. I have questions about this, but again, getting some comments in here as well. With the increasing interest and focus on obesity and diabetes, I think we've all seen, a lot going on in the news, and even with Alzheimer's. And I know Tez touched on some of those therapeutic areas earlier. Do you have any insights or pearls that you would share as we look to the near term and even maybe a bit further out on where you might see this playing around obesity and diabetes. And, I throw that out to you, Dan, and Tez, if you want to add color commentary as well.
I mean, there's so many levels to this. First and foremost is we're in a situation where demand is not being met by supply. So for these forecasts that Tez has shared to be realized, then manufacturing will need to ramp quickly. And there's been considerable investment into manufacturing facilities. I know Novo Nordisk is putting something like $6 billion into its existing plant in Denmark. More investments else, I think, in France. Eli Lilly has also made similar press releases about its investment in the European manufacturing for these therapies. So just purely to meet current demand for weight loss, then yeah, manufacturing is scaling. Then we also have the scenario whereby, well, what if these drugs are successful beyond obesity? There are clinical trials ongoing across the spectrum of, I guess, cardiometabolic diseases. We've spoken a little bit about NASH. Chronic kidney disease is another one. There's the potential for these drugs and their labels to cover a large number of patients beyond what we currently have. And in order to reach these patients, manufacturing is going to have to grow even further. So it's a tightrope walk between investing in manufacturing now to meet demand that might be there in the future, and then do you invest all of that at risk? But at the moment, it's a two-horse race, and I think these companies can err on the side of, I guess, deploying them, with more certainty once these trials are positive. But I think there could even be some upside to some of these eye-watering forecasts that we're seeing today. I don't know, Tez, feel free to come in. The other point I wanted to make was just around that obesity story and the quality of the weight loss and how this market is going to fragment. At the moment, it's a two-horse race. We know the clinical data. We know that obesity is now a serious medical condition, and managing weight has long-term benefits, not just in BMI, but in cardiovascular outcomes. But there's a quality of weight loss question. How is this weight being lost? Is it muscle mass? Is it fat? There's how long can you persist on therapy? What's the side effect profile like? That's been in the news recently. So as more and more clinical trials are done, there is the potential for this market to fragment. There might be an ideal drug for a certain setting. There might be, you mentioned danuglipron, oral GLP-1s, where are these going to fit into the treatment algorithm? Where is combination drugs going to fit into the treatment algorithm? This market is very attractive for not just the two incumbents, but for many others that may be looking to invest in joining this obesity market. So as the market fragments, as new clinical trials are run, as physicians get more comfortable, as payers get more comfortable, there is a lot of interesting dynamics that are still to play out. But at the moment, it's amazing to be at the start of a market, watching this market being created, and I guess hypothesizing over which direction it's going to be heading.
Thank you, Dan. Tez, anything to add on?
Yes, certainly, Melody. I can jump in here from a neuroscience perspective, seeing that's my background. So it is great seeing some movements in the market and some new launches, particularly for schizophrenia and Alzheimer's. So for schizophrenia and psychoses, there still remains lots of unmet medical need. Even though there are therapies on the market, some of the treatments seem to not quite hit the mark, and there's lots of switching between therapies. But seeing this new, completely novel mechanism and this new therapy coming through with such great safety efficacy profile coming out, then that's looking really promising. So we're really looking forward to seeing how that would impact. With regards to neurodegeneration, clearly there are huge socioeconomic implications here with senescence and an aging population. So but going again back to the beta amyloid story and how that there seems to be this persistence from the industry to really investigate the efficacy of these antibodies against beta amyloid. It is showing now to be, something that is coming to fruition. It is really paying off. There are improvements around, to the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. So yeah, this is looking really promising. Whereas previously, I think in neuroscience there was, looking for those rising star assets that were being developed globally was, it was a tough look, a tough find, so to speak. Other than those assets outside of epilepsy. So these new launches are certainly looking very promising.
Wonderful. Thank you both for that. Let's jump into an equally large, maybe even larger pool. I want to go into the oncology space. So do you see the oncology space continuing to rise, or is there a bit of a backing off in this area? No pan-cancer, no real blockbusters, certainly nothing the size of Keytruda or Herceptin. Said another way, do you think that we've picked the low-hanging fruit here?
Well, that's a provocative question, Melody. I'm also just taking a big old step back. It's a long time since I'm not sure I've ever done a webinar like this where we haven't specifically mentioned cancer until 30, 35 minutes in. I'm not quite sure what the time set we currently are on. Perhaps that's also a sign that it's not the story that it once was. One thing I absolutely will say is that cancer has incredible momentum from investments that were perhaps made 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So that's going to carry oncology through, at least until the end of our consensus forecast period in 28. Just some brief numbers. This is an area we're often speaking about. The oncology market is worth somewhere in the region of 175 billion for prescription sales of the major pharma companies in 2022. Obviously, it's growing. It has grown at a double-digit rate for a decade and a half. It is continuing to grow at a double-digit rate through our consensus period. So that 175 billion in 2022 revenues is going to be about 350 in 2028. So doubling in size, continued double-digit growth. So I think with that being said, we should be talking about oncology. It's still hugely relevant for our industry. For pretty much all of the top 10 pharma have large oncology portfolios, the exception being Novo Nordisk. But is there the opportunity in the pipeline that there once was? Perhaps not. I mean, it's inevitable that things go through cycles. The more and more you invest, the more assets that get created, the more competition there eventually is. So when it comes to actually the end market, then you're dividing up the market with more and more players. So it's hard to justify the continued level of investment, and perhaps return on investment is pulling back. I've heard it said a few times, and by no means this is not my opinion, but it's as an expression, is cancer investable or is cancer uninvestable? I think that's sensationalist. I think there's no answer to that question, but certainly the degree of concentration, the degree of focus on cancer probably cannot be sustained, certainly for another 15 years, as we've seen looking backwards. So perhaps it is time that we are seeing pivots of investment into areas. Tez has mentioned neuroscience. We've had some really nice breakthroughs, the cardiometabolic space, continued investment into rare diseases. But yeah, cancer is hugely important for our industry. It's been a huge part of our past. It's a large part of our future. But perhaps it's an enabler for us to reinvest into other areas where we hope that the science can advance at the pace as it has done in cancer in other areas, and we can put some of that R&D to work.
Thank you. And we've seen a lot of activity, I think, in gene and cell therapy. And now there's a number of, I think, larger players that are focused on ADCs and the correlation between biomarker testing and results and the impact on the trajectory of the patient journey. So I think as the bar rises and we have new approaches and new technical platforms, I think there'll be new treatments, targeting certain types of cancer. Very exciting to watch.
And one area we've not mentioned, so ADCs, yes, bispecifics, yes, cell therapies, yes, mRNA cancer vaccines, maybe. That's the ultimate kind of personalized therapy where you can design a vaccine against the specific antigens or antigens that a patient is expressing. And we've seen some interesting data coming from Moderna and Merck, a collaboration there for a neoantigen vaccine. So perhaps where we're seeing cancer is becoming even more hyper-personalized. To go back right to your very first question of the low-hanging fruit being picked, perhaps, we certainly have been looking for that next checkpoint inhibitor, the next kind of big selling drug, but perhaps that's, we're looking in the wrong direction, and the continued benefit that the science is leading us towards continued precision medicine, I think, for cancer.
Thank you. I've gotten, let's cover off on 2 or 3 more questions. I've been getting some questions around vaccines, anti-infectives. I'll summarize here. In 2023, vaccines and anti-infectives have been predicted to shrink. Do we think that's still the case, especially with the chronic diligence around COVID and the seemingly routine practice of getting annual boosters, as well as increased focus on things like RSV and respiratory infection here in the US? What do you think that sort of begins to look like as we look ahead for vaccines and anti-infectives?
Well, there's certainly a market for long-term management of COVID. We know that there is a booster market. We know that there is stockpiling of antivirals. The scale of that market perhaps was overestimated previously. I believe Tez was mentioning how Pfizer's been revising its forecasts down specifically for COVID products. So, I mean, yeah, the market is shrinking, but it's shrinking from some height, and it may be some time again before those heights are ever reached. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that vaccines, it doesn't mean that infectious diseases isn't going to be growing. You rightfully mention RSV, GSK and Pfizer are both in this space, as Moderna will be shortly, we hope. New advancements going on into flu vaccines, the potential to combine flu with RSV, with COVID in a single vaccine, that could be transformational in terms of getting better coverage rates for vaccines each year when we all go for our boosters. So technology is leading an advance, I think, in vaccines. And we also hope that technology will allow us to vaccinate against diseases that we haven't been able to previously. As companies that are in this vaccine space are successful, and as they wish to continue to be in the vaccine space, they're going to need to continue to look at creating vaccines for things such as HIV, diseases that are huge public health burdens that we haven't been able to crack yet, but maybe there's a technological solution to that. So I watch this space story for vaccines. RSV is the story for this year. Perhaps flu will be the story for next year, as and when the mRNA data for flu becomes available, and then potentially this forms part of what what's on the market. And then long term, what can we vaccinate against that we aren't currently?
I love what you said, Dan. And I know that there's we've heard the phrase treatment cocktails for certain types of immune suppressed diseases, et cetera. And I just thought of a new one, vaccine cocktails. And so interesting to hear that so many things might be able to be combined in one shot. And that also has cost savings for patients, right? And for payers as well. I'm going to open up another big area here. We've had a few comments about this. I'm surprised it hasn't come up sooner, is the role of AI. And what are our thoughts here around the role of artificial intelligence in targeting therapeutic areas and its potential to accelerate the R&D pathway? So Dan, very nicely on, you were talking about, the length, and listen, at the end of the day, there's still a lot of time and money to bring a product to market. And one way to help accelerate that runway is to condense the time required and the manpower required. And one way to do that is to leverage, to a greater extent, AI. What are your thoughts on the ability to do that and the potential for it to impact drug development as we know it today?
Well, AI is part of our current reality. That's absolutely clear. How much of an effect it's having at the moment is more debatable. The one thing I keep coming back to is that all of these drugs that were designed by AI, and I use that in a very loose, kind of colloquial way. There hasn't yet been a drug that's passed the phase 2 hurdle that's AI designed. Phase 2 is the biggest hurdle of drug development, when I think only 3 in 10 programs typically pass, because this is when we kind of come up against that biological understanding of a disease. We've had a couple of shots on goal, maybe even a few shots on goal, and nothing's progressed any further. I think it's slightly hard to, or unfair to, tarnish AI with all of AI and the use of drug development with that brush. I just think we're so early on into understanding its potential that it's kind of hard to extrapolate meaningfully to kind of quantify an impact of AI on the whole of the pharma industry. So I'm a cautious, I'm not even going to say optimistic or pessimistic, realist, I suppose. Show me a use case where AI is having a tangible dollar impact, and I'd love to hear about it. There are definitely use cases where AI is being used in the earlier stages prior to getting a drug into clinical trials. I know there are use cases where AI is being used to run clinical trials more efficiently. Use cases where AI can be used to write regulatory documents and to kind of reduce some of the burdensome tasks. So there are so many ways which it's being deployed. And these will all be necessary to help kind of mitigate the rise that we're seeing in R&D costs. And this will allow us to be more efficient. This will allow pharma to launch more drugs in a given year than it has previously. This is potentially all going to be underpinning the pharma's long-term potential and relevance. So yeah, embrace AI, or we're all learning about it, but to kind of distill it down into what impact is it having, I think the value in that question is more in the discussion it then poses and the use cases, rather than kind of trying to answer too definitively.
Thank you, Dan. Tez, anything you want to add to that?
I think Dan, again, has covered everything perfectly. It is a case of watch this space. There is certainly a lot of momentum around these companies, and a lot of people believing that this is the way forward, and choosing to invest their monies in these particular companies. But again, it's until there's anything tangible, then I'd prefer to sit and wait.
So we're going to take one last question from the audience. I want to thank all of you who have been submitting questions and comments. I've received a couple comments around the role of payers. We certainly know it's important. I'm going to take a swing at this and then open it up to my colleagues to add further comment. As some of the topics I've been sending over to Dan for response, this is a very, very big topic, but let's dig in a little bit here. The fact that there's legislation impacting PBMs, the middlemen, if you will, could result in those middlemen squeezing drug manufacturers as well as payers. Another development with significant potential to impact payers is something that the three of us have talked about already during this session, is the increased focus on obesity. Listen, we know it's a high-priced treatment, and given statistics around obesity, it's hugely expensive. Payers have got to find a way to say no. They're simply saying they can't afford it. It's that elusive balance between buyer innovation versus society's needs and treatment advances, the affordability challenge. The US payer landscape, as we all know, is evolving. Insurers and drug supply middlemen have become more powerful guardians of US healthcare spend thanks to consolidation. The big three PBMs, names we've all heard, Caremark, Express Scripts, and OptumRx, actually process 80% of all prescription drug claims, and they're actually owned by large insurance firms, CVS Health, Cigna, and United Health Group, respectively. These groups also own specialty pharmacies. Controlling more of the drug supply chain ultimately gives them increased clout and in negotiations with drug manufacturers. So, and the other phenomenon we're seeing even after squeezing the drug manufacturers for hefty rebates and overcharging for some generics, insurers are also ramping up the use of tools. Now, some of the concepts I'm going to talk about here are not new concepts. I remember working with these back in the 90s, right? It's just, I think, the way they're being applied and the magnitude to which they're being applied that maybe has changed or evolved a little bit. First is limiting, obviously, the access to certain treatments through prior authorization, requiring doctors to seek permission from the insurer before prescribing. Step therapy mandates that patients try cheaper alternatives first. Insurers are also designing new kinds of barriers, such as new to market blocks, limiting access to novel drugs for a year after approval. In a 2021 survey, over half of 17 large commercial insurance plans had specialty drug coverage policies that were actually more restrictive than the FDA label. Other tactics steer patients towards insurers' preferred products, those that are cheapest or carry the highest rebates by hitting out-of-pocket costs. You know, again, we see that cost shifting, not a new concept, but being applied to a different magnitude and for different purposes. Any measures that hit the insurers or PBM's bottom lines will have a knockoff effect on drug companies. We know that's going to happen. Pharma is going to be squeezed for greater rebates and or see their drugs relegated to non-preferred formulary status or hefty copays, being relegated to the back seat, if you will. The last thing that I'll say about this is accompanying U.S. payers' growing power over the drug industry is a shift towards value-based care, another term we've heard, reimbursing care by disease-specific outcomes rather than individual drugs. This will further pressurize manufacturer prices as more products compete in the same therapy areas. Product differentiation becomes both more urgent and more difficult, making that value story. And as we spoke about earlier, being able to demonstrate the value of a newer product over one that is already on the market. Dan, Tez, anything to add to this topic?
I mean, two anecdotes or data points come to mind, but nothing that I can really add beyond, the extensive discussion that you've provided. The first is a report that I saw that was published last week that actually painted more of a rosier picture, whereby spending at the net price level as actually the forecasts for net price spending have been revised upwards, whereas previously they were flat in the US, which so at Evaluate, we often speak about how, I said like 6 or 7% CAGR growth for prescription drug revenues, but that doesn't take into effect rebating. But actually, this report that I was looking at perhaps suggests that the level of rebating isn't increasing, and perhaps it might be moderating if actually net spending is able to grow. So that's a bit more of a positive look at this. The other thing, and this isn't an answer, it's a question. I mean, it's US election year, and there are policies that we perhaps don't know about yet that will come to the fore, and policies that curb pharma revenues are always kind of pronounced in an election year as potential vote winners. So we don't know what we don't know yet. PBMs could well be a target for legislation, but I would be surprised if the pricing lobby doesn't also continue to take a look at pharma. They've had their win with the Inflation Reduction Act with Medicare spending, but the vast majority of healthcare spend on drugs is in that commercial channel. So wait and see.
Thank you, Dan. Tez, any comments here?
I won't be able to offer anything of value in this, so let's move along.
Wonderful. So in summary, The 2024 preview focuses on projects and companies with the largest commercial potential, but there's plenty of activity, as you've heard today, expected from projects that lie outside these blockbusters. For instance, 2024 could see the first approval for the Claudin 18.2 mechanism, Astellas's zolbetuximab, a novel cancer target that now boasts a packed pipeline. PRMT5 is another nascent oncology mechanism that is moving up investors' radars, with several developers, including Mirati and Tango, claiming to be in the lead. AstraZeneca recently threw its hat in the ring here, signaling that this is a space to watch. Gene therapy will continue to be a preoccupation for biopharma in 2024, even if its commercial potential remains an open question. Abiona's prademagene zimicrocel, the first gene therapy for the devastating skin condition, epidermolysis bullosa, will hear on approval next year. And the first therapy to use gene editing, Vertex and CRISPR Therapies Casgevy for sickle cell, could commence its global rollout, should approvals in the US and EU follow a green light in the UK. Other closely watched projects that fell outside these top 10 lists include Merck's attempt to rescue the cholesterol-lowering PCSK9 mechanism with a more commercially attractive oral option. The pivotal program for MK1606 began last year, with data likely in early 2026. Protagonist's J&J partnered oral IL-23 receptor blocker is also being closely watched as it progresses through phase 3 trials in ulcerative colitis next year. An effective oral agent in this market, dominated by injected mAbs, could be a game changer. Really something to watch. In metabolic disease, which we've talked about, just outside this list are other richly valued assets, including Lilly's retatrutide, a triple-targeted project known as Triple G, that produced competitive weight loss at phase 2 and is already in pivotal testing. Boehringer Ingelheim took a Zealand pharma-originated GLP-1 glucagon coagonist into phase 3 in mid-2023, and the future of Pfizer's oral danuglipron is awaited after the once-daily related disaster. Later in 2024, phase 2 data will emerge on Amgen's maridebart cafraglutide, which blocks GLP-1, and uniquely in this field, activates the GIP receptor. The group will also report data on an early-stage oral obesity project next year, AM786, a non-incretin-based project. This is a class with huge potential, as we've talked about, and any sniff of safety concerns would be considered cataclysmic for this sector. Elsewhere, CAR-T technologies is likely to be a theme for 2024, particularly after the safety issue flagged by the FDA. This could have repercussions as CAR-T moves beyond cancer into autoimmune conditions. Early data in diseases like lupus will garner significant focus for this sector in 2024. Radiopharmaceuticals, after loads of M&A and data, will be watched. So as you can see, there is a lot to watch for in 2024, both to the upside and possibly some headwind in certain areas. With that, I would like to wrap up today's session. First, I would like to thank today's speakers, Dan Chancellor and Tsang. Thank you, gentlemen. A special thank you to all of you joining us today and for those who submitted questions and comments. Again, any questions that we did not have time to get to will be answered in follow-up communications. If you'd like to speak to us further, please drop a note into the Q&A and we will reach out to you shortly. We will share the full recording of the webinar following today's session, along with a link to download both the slides and the report. We hope to see you soon at the next Evaluate webinar. Good day, and thank you, everyone.